Hello, Stephan here with Liquidity with a video about German Army ranks.
Liquidity.
This video is about the modern day German military, so if you're interested in hearing anything that happened before the end of World War II, this is not a video for you. I have my own experience in the German military. When I graduated from high school, I was drafted into the military. Nobody asked me, would you like to join the military? Nope, I got a letter and they basically told me, either you join the military or you pretend to be a pacifist and do some kind of alternative civilian duty, which will take you even longer away from what you want to do actually in life, or we will prosecute you and you will go to jail. So for 12 months, I was part of an engineer battalion in the German military, in the German army, Bundesheer. So all of the armed forces of the Federal Republic of Germany, of modern day Germany, are called Bundeswehr. And then we have Bundesheer, which is the army. We have Bundesluftwaffe, which is the Air Force. We have Bundesmarine, which is the Navy, not to be confused with the Marines. I'm also not going to talk about the Austrian military or the Swiss military. They both have very good militaries and they have their own traditions and they have their own ranking systems. There's a lot of overlap between the German and the Austrian and the Swiss ranking systems, but they're a little bit different. I'm going to make comparisons between the German army and the US Army in particular, simply because those are the two armies that I'm most familiar with, and also the United States is the most prominent of all English-speaking countries. The US Army and the German Army have in common that they have basically, roughly speaking, three different groups of soldiers, of people who are part of the military. There are, first of all, people who are just the regular enlisted people, Mannschaften. And when I was in the military, most people were part of that simply because the vast majority of people were drafted personnel, people who were brought in through basic training, then special weapons training, and then maybe some additional training, or just basically used for cheap labor after that. The second group are non-commissioned officers, which in the German military we call Unteroffiziere. Basically under officers or lower ranking officers. And the third group in the US military and the US Army are called commissioned officers. In the German military, we call them Offiziere. Those are just regular officers. And then there are subgroups among them as well. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. So the regular enlisted personnel in German we would call Mannschaften, which loosely translates as crew. And the lowest rank, which is the equivalent to a private in the US Army, is just called Soldat. But that's actually not what they're called within their units. They're actually called according to what unit they belong to. So I was a member of an engineer battalion. An engineer in German is Pionier. So when I started, I was Pionierschaffrat. So when I was a brand spanking new recruit, fresh meat, I was just Pionierschaffrat. If you're part of a mechanized infantry unit, you would be Panzergrenadier. If you're a member of an artillery unit, you might be Kanonier or Panzerkanonier, depending on what kind of artillery it is, whether it is, part of a Panzerhaubitze, for instance, these large vehicles that look like large tanks, but they're actually artillery pieces. If you're part of a communications unit, you would be Funker, which may sound a little funky, but that has nothing to do with being funky. The German word der Funke means spark. So funken means actually to communicate via electricity. So Funker is somebody who is part of a communications unit. The German military that I served in, it was quite different from the German military as it appears now. There are several big changes that have been made. For once, we don't have a military draft. We haven't had a military draft for over 2 decades. I was one of the last years to be drafted. I think they stopped in the mid 1990s, I think, or end of the 1990s. That's one big thing. When I was in the military, yes, there were some female soldiers, but those were the grave exceptions, and they were limited to basically the medical field, medical specializations. Beginning in 2001, men and women would serve in any kind of function. There was no discrimination. Also in the early 2000s, the German military openly admitted and declared that it had to change its approach to lesbians and gays, that there used to be systematic discrimination against lesbians and gays, and actually there were some reparations for people who were in the military and who had been disadvantaged because they were lesbians and gays and were outed and had some repercussions personally, professionally, and were made to live in a very hostile work environment. So a lot of big changes. In my opinion, very good changes. I would much rather serve in today's military than back in the 1990s. That being said, even though I didn't want to be there, even though this was not my choice, even though I didn't volunteer to be in the military, I'm still glad I had that experience. Looking back, I wish I had had a positive attitude toward it and actually signed up for a few years. Would have gotten paid a lot more. After I served for 6 months in the military, I was promoted to Gefreiter. Me and everybody else, unless you did something egregious. I wasn't like a model soldier by any means, by any standards. I didn't really want to be there, so I didn't really exhaust myself. I didn't do anything above and beyond what I was supposed to do. Just did my duty, that's all I did. And, you know, all of us were then promoted automatically to Gefreiter. Gefreiter is basically private first class. And Gefreiter, the meaning of that means actually Befreiter, somebody who's freed originally from certain kinds of guard duty, maybe. Speaking of which, guard duty was my favorite thing to do in the military. It was actually kind of nice being in a small unit and being responsible for something very specific. Yeah, that was actually nice, armed guard duty. So once you are no longer a private, once you're no longer Pionier, Schütze, Grenadier, Kanonier, whatever else it may be that you were, once you are Gefreiter, you get certain insignia that you put on your epaulette that goes on a sleeve on your epaulette right here on your shoulder, on both of your shoulders. And for Gefreiter, it looks like this. So these are like outward facing slanted stripes. And if you get promoted again, you would be Obergefreiter. Ober just means over or above. And then you get 2 of these stripes. Now, if you stuck around long enough, you might also be promoted to Hauptgefreiter, which would be the main Gefreiter. Haupt just means main or principal. And those people have 3 stripes. Now, there's one more that I saw when I was serving in the military, and that would be Stabsgefreiter. That person actually has 4 stripes that are forward slanting. And then there are 2 more in this category that did not exist when I was in the military that were kind of introduced later on. And that would be Korporal and Stabskorporal. And those are very specialized. There are very, very few of them. Those are kind of like specialists in the U.S. military in a way. They can have leadership duties to a certain extent over maybe a squad of people or a group of people, a team of people, but they're not officers in any way or shape or form, unlike the U.S. military corporal. The German military has 2 types or 2 levels of non-commissioned officers. So non-commissioned officers is basically anybody above your regular enlisted person and below lieutenant, below the commissioned officers. And in the US military, those are pretty much all the different kinds of sergeants that there are. So there's simple sergeants, there's staff sergeants, and so on. And in the German military, that grouping is actually broken up into two different categories again. There's one ohne Portepee, and then there's the other one mit Portepee. With Portepee, without Portepee. And Portepee is a kind of old-fashioned military term that now just looks like a decorative rope, but originally it was actually a place to hang a saber from. So if you were a non-commissioned officer who was given a specific saber, and this is where you would hold it on, that would be the distinction of being a little bit more in charge of things, in charge of more people, have more responsibilities than other non-commissioned officers. So among the Unteroffiziere ohne Portepee, we have simply Unteroffizier. And here's the insignia for that. For the collet, for that looks just like a elongated horseshoe, really. And then if you see an elongated horseshoe that's closed, that would be the next one, and that's Stabsunteroffizier. And those are the people who guided us through basic weapons training, for instance. There's one special kind of non-commissioned officer or Unteroffizier ohne Portepee, and that is Fahnenjunker. So this is somebody who's had some special training already, but is still relatively in the beginning of officer training. That person may have the same responsibility as other Unteroffiziere ohne Portepee, but they are working toward becoming lieutenant eventually. But there are a couple other steps in between. Where does this word come from? So Fahne just means flag. Junker is actually a very old military term that is probably mostly from the northern German area, especially areas that are no longer Germany, part that those areas that are now Poland, like East Prussia, West Prussia, a lot of those old Prussian areas. There are different definitions for the word Junker. It basically means a young nobleman, somebody who may be of noble birth, but is still a young person, still hasn't been promoted to a certain rank yet. So obviously within military history, that is somebody who has the potential of becoming an officer, but is not quite there yet. They have the pedigree, if you will, back then that really made a little bit more, that made a real difference. But yet that's where that word comes from. So Junker also means like a young nobleman. Unteroffiziere mit Portepee, the ones that originally would be given a saber to carry along, and the Portepee is where you would hold your saber in, where you would carry your saber in. Those are pretty much all called Feldwebel. And Feldwebel originally was a non-commissioned officer who was in charge of making sure that everybody was exactly where they needed to be in battle formation. So think about back hundreds of years when you had hundreds of people marching in line, first with huge pikes during the times of the Landsknechte, and then later on with some primitive firearms, and then later on with some slightly more modern firearms, front loader firearms, muskets, those kinds of things. And they all were marching in formation. Feldwebel is the one who would move up and down the ranks, make sure there were no stragglers, make sure nobody was getting ahead. Because Webel is from an old Germanic word that basically means to move to and fro. And among Feldwebel, you have different ranks. So you have the basic Feldwebel, and then you have the other ones. And here are the insignia that go on the epaulets that are first for Feldwebel. And then we have Oberfeldwebel, Hauptfeldwebel, Stabsfeldwebel, and Oberstabsfeldwebel. So those are Very important, very well seasoned, very specialized people, especially the higher ups, people who have a lot of experience, very important non-commissioned officers who form the backbone of training and guiding other people along. Within this group, you also have people who are training to be officers, just like the Fahnenjunker. After additional training, you then get promoted to Fähnrich, and Fähnrich really means like the guy who's carrying the standard, the battle flag. It's just like Fahnenjunker would carry a standard. Fähnrich also would basically be the same thing, but a more senior person of that. And then you also have Oberfähnrich. So those are people, young men or women, who are training to become lieutenants, commissioned officers, but they're not quite there yet. Among the commissioned officers, you would have Leutnante and Hauptleute. So that would be the lowest cadre of commissioned officers, and those would be the types who would be working directly within the company. So Leutnant would be in charge of maybe a platoon. Hauptmann would be in charge of an entire company. An Oberleutnant is somewhere between them, might be in charge of an entire company. So for instance, the second half of my military service, that company had an Oberleutnant as a commanding officer. So they're somewhere in between. So if I compare that with the American military, Lieutenant is actually second lieutenant, Oberleutnant would be first lieutenant, and Hauptmann would be captain. Not to be confused with a ship's captain or with the Navy captain or Bundesmarine Kapitän. Those are much higher ranking actually. They're a little different. It's a little bit confusing. Oh yes, and then there's also Stabshauptmann. This is a relatively new one and a very rare one. This is somebody who is a commissioned officer, who's a captain, but who has like special training and is working kind of behind the scenes, maybe in intelligence, maybe in like a logistics expert. I don't know exactly how this works, but this is a relatively new one. The middle category of commissioned officers would be called Stabsoffiziere or staff officers. And there you have Major, which is a major. Here's the insignia for that one, for the epaulette, right? Which you would see on there. He is Oberstleutnant. Oberst means colonel, so lieutenant colonel, Oberstleutnant. And then we also have Oberst, which is colonel. So these are very similar to the US Army. So we have major, lieutenant colonel, colonel. These are officers who are in charge of entire battalions, of regiments. They are reporting up to basically the generals who are more in charge of the strategic responsibilities. And just as in the American military and the American Army, you have different kinds of generals. So in the German military, you see how many gold stars you basically have on your shoulder here. So the lowest one would be Brigade General, then followed by General Major. That one is followed by Generalleutnant. And then the highest one is simply General. And of those, actually, I think there's only one of them, and that is actually the person in charge of the entire military. A few years ago, a decision was made that these ranks would not be changed or would not reflect gender. In their origin, of course, they're masculine. For instance, Gefreiter sounds like a masculine person, a Hauptmann, principal man, right? That those are masculine terms. However, in today's modern German military, they're not to be seen as male or female or any other gender. They're just simply to be seen as a rank, as a person's rank within the military. So when you address especially an officer, you're supposed to use either Herr or Frau, or if there's something else, then that would have to be clarified. And I'm not really sure what that would be. I just simply don't know. So when you're a simple enlisted person and you talk to a non-commissioned or commissioned officer, you would say Herr Feldwebel or Frau Feldwebel, or you would say Frau Leutnant. I hope this video was somewhat interesting. I hope it was enjoyable. If you did enjoy it or if you liked it, please give it a like and check out my other videos. If there are other videos that you find somewhat interesting and stimulating, please consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't done so already.